Hello and welcome to the Times of India. You're watching Global Pulse with me, Neha Khanna. The colonial era is over. You cannot talk to India and China in that tone. That is Russian President Vladimir Putin's warning to the United States and its president. And we wholeheartedly agree. Addressing a press conference in Beijing following the SCO summit, Putin said, and I quote, "Countries have had difficult periods in their history, such as colonialism and attacks on their sovereignty for prolonged periods of time. Now that the colonial era is over, they have to realize that they cannot use this tone in speaking with their partners." Needless to say, Putin's stern message to the US comes in the backdrop of escalating tensions in the India-US relationship thanks to Trump's steep 50% tariffs on India as punishment for buying Russian oil and the daily insults and unhinged attacks by his close aides on the world's largest democracy. Remember Trump's jibe at India, calling it a dead economy? Quite possibly in retaliation to that, Putin described India and China as economic giants and cautioned against any nation trying to dominate global politics or security. The Russian president said, "From an international law point of view, everyone must have equal rights and must be in a similar position." Evidently, the United States is quite rattled by the show of solidarity and bonhomie among the leaders of India, China and Russia at the recent SCO summit. Trump's trade advisor, Peter Navarro, who has been launching daily attacks on India and Prime Minister Modi, was clearly not amused by the sight of Prime Minister Modi, Xi Jinping and Putin smiling, holding hands and hugging. Images that have gone viral and grabbed international headlines. Navarro said it's a shame that Modi is getting in bed with Xi Jinping and Putin. Remember, India is the only country to have been hit by Trump's secondary tariffs, despite the fact that China is the world's largest buyer of Russian crude. And maybe Trump is not yet content with almost wrecking the India-US relationship. Maybe he wants to inflict even greater damage. On Wednesday, when asked why he had not taken any further action against Putin and Russia for the continuing war in Ukraine, Trump snapped at the reporter and said, "How do you know there is no action? Would you say that putting secondary sanctions on India, the largest purchaser of Russian oil outside of China, is no action? That cost hundreds of billions of dollars to Russia. You call that no action? And I haven't done phase 2 or phase 3 yet. But when you say there is no action, I think you ought to get yourself a new job." Well, apart from insulting the reporter, was Trump threatening fresh sanctions on India, which already faces, as we said, the highest tariffs imposed by the Trump administration on any trading partner? If he was, he would do well to listen to the advice of his European allies. Finland's president, Alex Stubb, has said, "If Europe and America don't have a more cooperative foreign policy towards the global south and India, then we will lose." The SCO meeting in China is a reminder to the West about what is at stake, he said. Well, everyone seems to understand that except Donald Trump and his minions, who keep parroting his lines and take turns to insult India. And the Finland president is right. America will lose, and strong signs of it are already emerging. No, we're not saying that. Global experts are. The chief economist at credit rating agency Moody's has said the United States is on the brink of recession. According to Mark Zandi, who was amongst the first economists to predict the 2008 financial crisis, Based on data, the states that make up nearly one-third of the US GDP are either already in recession or at high risk of entering one. Zandi has gone on to say, for the average American, that risk shows up in two ways. It means higher prices at the stores, and it means job disruption across industries tied to food, goods, and transportation. The chief economist at Moody's added that he is worried about the US tariffs hurting American companies' profits and ongoing troubles in the US housing market. Zandi says American consumers' spending in 2025 until July has barely budged from last year's, and that is worse than any year since 2008-2009, indicating an economy on the brink of a recession. But who's going to tell Donald Trump that? We're asking on Global Pulse tonight, going by the recent SEO summit and the global reactions to it, the growing talk of geopolitical realignments and a shifting balance of power, and predictions of a US recession. Is Trump, through his trade wars and disastrous foreign policy, increasingly isolating and weakening the United States itself? Don't his illogical, downright dangerous and destructive actions fly in the face of his biggest campaign plank, MAGA, or Make America Great Again? Is Trump uniting the rest of the world against his own country and setting the United States back by decades? And in doing so, has he set into motion the decline of the American empire and a reorganization of the global order?
How do you know there's no? How do you know there's no action? Really? Wait. Who are you with? Who are you with?
I'm with Polish media.
Okay. How do you know there's no action? Would you say that putting secondary sanctions on India, the largest purchaser outside of China, they're almost equal? Would you say there was no action? That cost hundreds of billions of dollars to Russia. You call that no action? And I haven't done phase 2 yet or phase 3.
Countries like the vast and populous nation of India, with almost 1.5 billion people, and the immense country of China, with its 300 million inhabitants, possess powerful and influential economies, but they also operate under their own distinct and comprehensive domestic laws. Do you fully understand the implications of this? Because when people from the outside say, we're going to pressure you now, we're going to punish you now, how should the leadership of such powerful, large countries which have gone through difficult times and very challenging periods in their history related to colonialism, related to repeated attempts over a long historical period to infringe on their sovereignty, respond? How are they supposed to react? But if any of them shows weakness, that's it. Their political career is over. Just like the colonial era eventually came to a definitive end, so too will this period. And today, it's simply and utterly impossible to talk to guys like that in such a harsh and aggressive tone.
All right, let's go straight across to our special guest. We're happy to be joined on Global Pulse tonight by Edward Price. He is an economic analyst and senior fellow at the School of Professional Studies at New York University. Edward Price, great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, let me begin by asking you this. Very interestingly, you have said you suggest 0% tariffs on India and that Donald Trump should actually apologize to India. Then you go on to say, I can't for the life of me understand why the US president, in confrontation with China and in a war with Russia, has decided to impose 50% tariffs on India. Believe me, neither can we. But it looks like Trump could actually make matters much worse, because now he's saying, I haven't even begun phase 2 or phase 3 yet. Does it look like Donald Trump is threatening India with more sanctions?
Well, it might look like that, yes. And this is very troublesome because the reason that I said, look, 0% tariff on India would make much more sense than 50% is because 0 is an absurd number, just as 50 is, but 0 is better because we want closer ties with India. And I say we, and I mean that the vast majority of American citizens, of which I'm one, and I think the vast majority of sensible Westerners, including the president you just mentioned, want better relationships between the US and India. We were trying for 30 years to try and improve our relationship with India. And so Donald Trump coming along and saying, look, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, yeah, it doesn't sound good.
It doesn't sound good. Let me ask you this, Edward. You've also said that Trump's tariff offensive could jeopardize years of progress in building trust, and that this partnership will decide what happens between China and Russia, America's real adversaries. Let me tell you what a majority of Indians feel today. There's a lot of anger and resentment in this country, and people believe that the United States can no longer be trusted. Do you believe that Trump, with his trade war, has pretty much torched the India-US relationship? And it's not just the tariffs, it's also the daily insults that are being hurled at India by Trump and his closest aides.
Well, I think that the majority of Indians are smarter than Donald Trump, and they're not going to accept the burning of a bridge. I don't think that the majority of Indians are going to be pushed around either towards China and Russia or towards the US. They're going to do exactly what they want within their own sovereign interests. And so, yes, Donald Trump has done things that seem to hold a flame to the relationship between the US and India, but it's up to India to decide whether that becomes a conflagration. I'll just make one other quick point. We began this segment with a quote from President Putin, and that quote was essentially half right. Putin is right to say that the US should not be addressing India in the way that it has. That's completely correct. But Putin is wrong to say that the colonial era is over. This is a man who is engaged right now in colonization and war in Eastern Europe. And so this is a very tricky situation because the rhetoric that Putin offers is good with regard to the US and India relations, but his actions are bad. And I would encourage any of your audience to remember that India has its own sovereign interests, and that might mean in the future closer relations with the US in a future configuration of US governments.
Okay, you think the era of colonialism is not over, but then, two wrongs don't make a right. If Putin, for instance, is being accused of engaging in that sort of behavior, well, then I think a similar allegation can perhaps be leveled against Trump. Many, are accusing the United States of behaving like an imperial power. But, a lot to unpack here as far as the geopolitical movements are concerned. But first and foremost, let me ask you this, Edward. Mark Zandi, the chief economist at credit rating agency Moody's, has actually painted a very grim picture for the American economy. He says it looks like the United States is on the brink of recession, and he's based this on a variety of data, which he says suggests that the states that make up nearly 1/3 of the US GDP are either already in recession or at the risk of entering one, and he is blaming it on America's tariffs. Do you agree with this assessment?
Broadly speaking, yes, I would agree with Zandi on that one, although there's a word of caution, which is that people like me who studied the US economy have been through a pretty bumpy 5 years. I was among the economists who correctly predicted that there would be inflation and that inflation would be persistent. I was then among the economists that got it totally wrong when I said that there was going to be a hard landing after steep rate hikes from the Federal Reserve. And so I think that the behavior and the nature of the US economy is changing such that the traditional economic models don't necessarily make as much sense. I'll give you an example. In March 2020, we saw probably the strangest US economy we've ever seen, in the sense that it was rip-roaring, unemployment was very low, and there was no inflation. And economists were scratching their heads as to why on earth this was the case. Nobody really knows because the pandemic intervened. I say that because when someone like Zandi, who's a very serious economist and should be listened to, predicts a recession, it should always be taken with a pinch of salt because the US economy is changing. That said, if you impose tariffs on foreign countries, what you're effectively doing is saying that all goods inside the economy, in this case the US economy, are more expensive. You have the same number of consumers chasing fewer goods, and that probably will lower demand in the United States, which is based on demand, consumer demand. So yes, recession is probably likely.
Zandi also says he's worried about US tariffs hurting American companies' profits and ongoing troubles in the US housing market. He says consumer spending until July of this year has barely budged from last year's, and this is worse than any year than 2008, 2009, and we all know what happened that year. What's your take?
Yeah, so as I say, the consumer segment of the US growth equation is about 70%. So 70% of growth in the United States is based on people buying things. And of course, so many of those things come from overseas. Now, we are at a funny position in our history as the US, because the essence of what Donald Trump has said is, hold on a second. That model of economics might be good for short-term growth. It might mean that places like Walmart and Target are heaving with cheap goods, but it is a strategic liability when it comes to things like steel, when it comes to things like medicines. And you have to hand it to the man for all of his deranged utterances. He has seen the fundamental imbalance in the global economy, which is effectively that the US says to the rest of the world, do things our way, use our currency, use our security services, and in exchange for that, you can send us the things that you make. Now, if every player in that arrangement is peaceable and has the best interests of the other player at heart, that probably is a good arrangement, right? It worked in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, it was okay. But what we're seeing today is unintended consequence. And what the US has done is expanded its markets and its technology all the way around the world, but not its constitutionalism. And so China and Russia, as sovereign states, have decided to take the advantage of modern economic growth, modern technology, but they're not on board with the political system and the global political system that the US has introduced, and therefore the clash.
So I'm going to quote Zandi one more time to you. He goes on to say, for the average American, the risk posed by American tariffs shows up in two ways. It means higher prices at the stores, inflation, something that the Americans are already reeling under, and it means job disruption across industries tied to food, goods, and transportation. So I'm going to ask you a direct question. Edward, do you agree with those who are making the case that the tariffs that are being imposed by Donald Trump on countries around the globe are eventually going to backfire on Americans and the American economy? Inflation is going to spiral. That could hurt the Republicans in the midterms next year. And we could very well see the US entering a recession. Do you agree with that entire assessment?
Yes, entirely. The tariffs are a fundamental strategic mistake. Let me do some like armchair quarterbacking, as the Americans say, and offer you what a trade war that was successful might have looked like, right? So let's imagine that the fundamental proposition of Donald Trump is correct, which is that there is an adversarial relationship between China and the US, and that adversarial relationship needs to be corrected through the economic lever. Let's just imagine that that's true for 1 second. If you really wanted to embark on that kind of confrontation with China as the United States, you need all the allies you can get. And so what you would probably have to do is slap some sort of tariff on China, some sort of punitive tariff such that their economy slows down a bit. But then what you have to do is at least two other things. One, in your domestic economy, you need all the Latin American labor you can get. We should be begging Latin American workers into the United States if we think we're going to try and compete with the population of China economically. It makes no sense that we're hounding them out or chasing them out through ICE. That makes no sense economically. That makes no sense in terms of strategy. And then the other thing you should do, two of two, is be nice to India. Be as nice as you can to India. I mean, it's really simple stuff. You cannot win the 21st century competition with China if you're chasing workers out of your economy and India out of your arms. That makes zero sense. So yes, the way that Donald Trump has gone about tariffs, for me, as someone who studied the economies of scale, is strange, but it's also strategically a mistake.
strategically a mistake. Unfortunately, Donald Trump is being anything but nice to India. Ironical that the Americans for a long time saw India as a democratic counterweight to China, especially in the economic sphere. Therefore, both sides invested deeply in this relationship for over a quarter of a century, and one man alone seems to have taken a wrecking ball to this relationship. And the largest buyer of Russian crude, as we all know, is China, but he decides to target India. What do you think, Trump's policy really here suggests to you? He's, how do you explain him going soft on China, talking, praising Xi Jinping, saying, I'm going to talk to him, I'm going to visit China perhaps later this year. He's a great leader. We're going to invite 600,000 Chinese students into the US. Much to the chagrin of MAGA, he's made that statement. And of course, he's talking about a trade deal between the US and China, while at the same time punishing tariffs on India. What is his thinking here, according to you?
Well, we're assuming that he is thinking, so that might be a fallacy to begin with. But what my brain wants to say in response to that is that there is some kind of hard cap on the ability of the United States to fight China economically, and that is the entanglement that we have in the dollar standard. So China is a source of demand for the US dollar, as is Japan, as are other countries around the world. And if it's the case that the United States and China really and truly fall out and break that international economic link, two things will happen. One, there will be, right now at least, shortages inside the United States that would, it's anyone's guess as to how that would play out politically, but I imagine that it would anger MAGA rather than please them. To real Chinese Communist Party has effectively been subsidizing their lifestyle for the last 25 years. And the second thing that would happen is that the international capital markets would take a long, hard look at the United States, and they would effectively say, look, if the United States has been providing fiat currency such that the international level of demand is met, that means that in essence, there are too many dollars to ever come back into the United States. That would be hyperinflation. And so if China and the US break their economic link, there will be problems in both countries, by the way. There'll be unemployed people in China, which is not good. But that would also be the moment at which people really question the dollar standard. And I think that probably constrains the president's behavior.
Some say that the bully in Washington has met a bigger bully in Beijing, and that is perhaps what explains why Trump is going soft on China. But, if he were in fact listening to you, Edward Price, what would your advice to Donald Trump be?
My advice to the President of the United States, if he's listening, which I doubt to me, would be to choose your battles. Choose your battles. And that's another way of saying choose your friends. If you want to embark on an economic correction with China, there is a very sensible argument for that. And I think that the Chinese agree. They want a consumer economy eventually, rather than one that simply exports goods to the rest of the world. And the United States wants to manufacture more. So the original Bretton Woods system and its reiteration in the 70s did indeed lead to a global imbalance. That's a funny thing to say because, of course, a classic trade economist would tell you that that's called comparative advantage and it's a good thing. It turns out that politically it's not a good thing. But it's very difficult for anyone to begin a fundamental renegotiation about two economies if you're doing it in an adversarial way. We really should not have gone about this in the way that we have. And my advice to the president would be choose your battles, be nice to your friends. And as I said, I'm repeating myself now, so I apologize. But please be nice to India above all, because they have the deciding vote in how the 21st century goes.
That is great advice, and I really hope that Donald Trump does listen to you sooner rather than later, Edward. But let me ask you this question. There are many who are saying perhaps India needs to walk away from the trade negotiations. Like I said, there's a lot of anger here, not just over the tariffs, but the constant insults that are being hurled at India, especially by Peter Navarro. After his boss called India a dead economy, Peter Navarro has called India the Maharaja of tariffs, a laundromat for the Kremlin, Ukraine war, Modi's war. Even using racist and caste slurs like talking about Brahmins profiteering. Do you believe there can still be a trade deal before the end of this year between India and the United States? Or has the situation really spun out of control at the moment? Though I must mention here that India's Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal has said that talks are on and there may well be a deal by November or December. What is your take?
My take is that Peter Navarro is historically illiterate, and speaking to the Indians in the way that he has is, I mean, I'm sort of stumbling over my words here because it's almost unbelievable given the history between India and the West. And broadly speaking, I think India has been very forgiving, very understanding. If you look at the broad strokes of Indian policy, compared to both China and Russia, it is the most sensible, it is the most balanced. And India has not built a foreign policy on the basis of anger or resentment, right? And so I think that it's very strange that the Americans, the officials representing me, would be trying to insult the Indians, given that the Indian state is pretty flexible, ultimately, in strategic terms. So, I mean, I said earlier, the way that we've treated India right now, to use a chess analogy, is like a queen fumble. It's completely unnecessary. It's something that we shouldn't have done, and I can only hope that the Indians are able to forgive the sort of behavior that we've indulged in and look at their long-term interests and see that the United States still has something to offer, which I think we do.
Okay, again, it is the ball really is in Donald Trump's court, isn't it? You know, there was a recent New York Times report, Edward, that said that following a phone call between Prime Minister Modi and Donald Trump on the 17th of June, Donald Trump got deeply offended. Why? Because of India's refusal to give him credit for the ceasefire with Pakistan, and India refuses to nominate him for a Nobel Peace Prize, and that he's acted against India and imposed these steep tariffs out of personal pique and vendetta. Is that something you would agree with?
Well, I don't know. I honestly find it exhausting to try and get inside the president's head every day, although I have to, and we all have to. I'm afraid to say I wouldn't be surprised. It's pretty obvious that the president is angling for the Nobel Peace Prize. Unfortunately, if you angle for the Nobel Peace Prize, you sort of need to have come up with peace somewhere, which I don't think he has. And the indication from India and Pakistan that he actually had nothing to do with that relationship is no doubt embarrassing. But I mean, look, let's try and pull this back to something a bit more positive. There are people like me who are US citizens who see this in a completely different light, see the relationship with India in a completely different light. And all I can do, as you've kindly had me on your show, is encourage your audience to remember that we exist and that most of us have a very respectful attitude towards India and have supported the last 30 or so years. I don't know what it's worth, probably nothing, but I apologize, and I'm sure a lot of other.
I have to say it's very kind and gracious of you, Edward.
Well, I think it's also a selfish strategic issue because, as I say, the United States needs India.
The United States needs India. Who's going to, make Donald Trump realize that, one story that grabbed international headlines this week, Edward, was the SEO summit and the bonhomie and the camaraderie that we saw among three leaders in particular, Prime Minister Modi, Xi Jinping and Putin, the smiles, the handshakes, the hugs and the holding of hands. Peter Navarro was not amused, and he says it's a shame that India is getting in bed with a dictator like Xi. The question I want to ask you is, do you believe Washington is rattled by what it saw recently at the SEO summit? Because many are now saying that Donald Trump, with his thoughtless actions and disastrous trade and foreign policy, may well have set into motion a reshaping of the global order. Do you agree with that?
Well, I mean, that would be to attribute to one man a sort of king status globally, which I'm not sure that Donald Trump is the independent variable here. And I'm not sure that President Xi Jinping or Putin or even Modi, I don't think any of these guys have full control over the global system. It is a complex ecosystem. It changes over time. We're seeing big historical shifts underway. would say that yes, the treatment of India probably encouraged Modi to make a public display of friendship towards China and Russia that he might not otherwise have done. I mean, he hasn't always gone to SCO, so that's one thing. But I would also encourage, as I said before, I'd encourage your listeners to remember that Modi is pretty smart, and he also did not go to the military parade. And so India, through Modi, is signaling not just to the Americans, but also to the Chinese and the Russians that they will not be spoken to. They will not be spoken to down, and that they have their own independent policy. And so what we are seeing is a shift in the world. We are seeing a change in the world, but it's not necessarily clear to me that that shift is going to be the combination of India, China, and Russia against the United States. I don't think that that's predetermined.
Okay, you don't think it's a revival of the RIC axis, but I want to quote to you Finland's President Alex Stubb, who has said, if Europe and America don't have a more cooperative foreign policy towards the global south and India, then we will lose. The SCO meeting in China is a reminder to the West about what is at stake. Does Donald Trump realize this, Edward? Does the Trump administration realize what is at stake, and that the SCO summit, whether they like it or not, is a signal that these countries have had enough of Trump's bullying? They do not want to be dictated to. They will continue to assert their strategic autonomy, and perhaps there is a shifting balance of power. There are many who've gone as far as to say the American empire is in decline, and Trump refuses to make his peace with that.
I think the president is correct. Stubb is correct. If the United States and the West more broadly, that's the European Union, I suppose that's Japan, if that grouping, including Australia and New Zealand, don't treat the global south with reverence, as any diplomatic relationship should be treated, then we will be in trouble, because the Chinese and the Russians will present a different model, and they will say, look, what we're offering is some form of economic security and uplift and respect, and that's in contrast to President Trump. I would also, however, remind everybody that there are, as I say, deep historic shifts. That's despite the current president does present a different model of the world versus what China and Russia are presenting. That is democracy. And so there is intrinsic value in human rights. There is intrinsic value in voting. There is intrinsic value in a civil society based on the rule of law. And these things are not just, la-di-da, abstract, nice things to say. They are also important in long-run economic development. And so when you look at the United States and its history, we've invented all sorts of things. And I think that is effectively because of the rule of law, because we have things like the First Amendment. So again, it's not for me to sit here on your show and lecture India at all. It's not for US officials to do that. But it's also not for Putin or Xi to do that. And India has to make its own decision, and it will. And I have no doubt that that decision will be smart, and it will balance the democratic interests of India against its external strategic needs.
India doesn't belong to any camp. I think it's made it abundantly clear that it maintains its strategic autonomy. But the message to Washington seems to be, do not try to bully us, do not dictate to us. Like I said earlier, for the longest time, Americans saw India as a democratic counterweight to China. But now, by punishing India with these tariffs and, in a sense, pushing India closer to China, hasn't Trump scored an own goal? I had an analyst on my show a few days ago who said, that this is something that the United States will end up paying a heavy price for in the long run. The US will pay for Trump's myopic actions. And there are also some who are saying that Trump is not making America great again. He's probably making China great again. That China is the biggest winner in all of this.
Well, I would say if we continue down this path, then yes, China is effectively gaining from the Trump presidency, because the contrast between China's behavior and Trump's behavior favors China. I mean, that's pretty axiomatic. That's pretty simple to see. But Trump is not the United States. He is not synonymous with the United States. The United States is a big, sprawling economy, a big, sprawling democracy, and we will change and we will adapt. And there are many of us at home who think that the president was probably right to point to the fact that there were people in the Rust Belt here who were suffering from underemployment, and probably right when he pointed out that we need to make strategic things like medicines and steal. I mean, that's a fair enough statement in an era of great power competition. The trouble is that all of our eyes move to Trump. We gaze at Trump. We listen to Trump. And that sort of is analytically a failure. I'm guilty of that failure because the United States itself is not the same as Trump. He is not the king. He is the president. And we have the courts, we have Congress, we have civil society, and we have a roaring financial sector and an economy that, albeit maybe into a recession, as we said earlier, is a strong and flexible economy. So we're not the same as the president. We're not the same thing.
You're not the same as the president, but there are many who are saying that the United States may end up paying the price for Donald Trump's myopic actions. Of course, I take the point that you're making, but last couple of questions before we let you go, Edward. There are many who are extremely pessimistic today about the India-US relationship under Donald Trump. Do you believe that we may actually have to ride out the 3.5 years of, the remainder of the Trump presidency before any semblance of normalcy actually can return to the India-US relationship? Because things really seem to have hit rock bottom. Do you believe there's any coming back from this anytime in the foreseeable future?
Well, I'm afraid to say I don't think this is rock bottom. But if you give us 400 or so days, there will be midterm elections in the United States, and we're going to see what the voting public in America thinks about Donald Trump. I really have been burned in the past when I've predicted elections. I've got some right, I've got some wrong, but I would not be surprised if the American public slapped Donald Trump on the wrist in the midterm elections. And that means voting in Republicans who are opposed to the worst parts of his policy and voting in Democrats who are opposed to the worst parts of his policy. There's a caveat there because there is gerrymandering in the US system going on. So it's hard to tell exactly which districts will go which way and what districts will look like. But I wouldn't be surprised if at the midterm elections, India and the rest of the world sees a reaction to Donald Trump. And so, 3.5 years is a long time. Give us 400 days, see what we do in the midterms, and maybe we can talk again.
We'd love to talk to you again after the midterms, but there is another school of thought that, if Donald Trump knows the Constitution doesn't allow him to run for another term, so does he even care about the outcome of the midterms? Yes, it'll hurt his party, but does he care?
He should care. Because in his second administration so far, he seems to have governed by diktat, by executive order, and he seems to have left the legislation well alone, other than for the one big brazen bill that he pulled out. So he doesn't want to govern via Congress. This is a departure from the past. I mean, you have presidents such as FDR, who basically agreed with the Supreme Court when it told him no. You had presidents such as LBJ, who basically asked the Congress, asked the Senate and Congress people for legislation and had a relationship with them. And the second Trump administration seems to have been focused on executive rule. Now, there are limits to that. There are challenges in the court, ongoing and increasing. And so I don't think that the president of the United States can continue to govern the way he is if Congress gets back in the game and if Congress decides to challenge him, which right now it's not, but that could change pretty quickly.
You're right. You're quite right there, because he may not be able to run for another term, but he certainly needs a majority in Congress to pass his critical legislation. Final question, Edward. Like I said, do you believe that the damage that Donald Trump has inflicted on the India-US relationship can be undone anytime in the foreseeable future? And doesn't it look like Trump has united the rest of the world against the United States?
It does look like that. Nonetheless, I believe that the relationship between India and the United States can be repaired and improved in the future. But that would require two things. One, the United States would have to stop behaving this way towards India. We have something of a point about buying Russian oil, and the war in Ukraine is egregious, but we can't slap a 50% tariff on India and expect India to take us seriously. And the second thing that would have to happen, and this is not for me to say, the sovereign Indian state and Modi and others would have to decide that they want a relationship with the United States. There are good strategic reasons for that. They are being masked today by the behavior of President Donald Trump, but they will outlast President Donald Trump. And I hope that in future, Indian officials and American officials can sit down and strike up a deal.
All right. Well, I can assure you that nobody here in India had their hands on that button of destruction on the India-US relationship. If anything, it really is the US president who seems to have caused all the damage. We certainly hope that, as you said, the relationship can be repaired, just that it's hard to be optimistic right now with Donald Trump in the saddle. But Edward Price, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time and perspective.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. All right, on Global Pulse, let me now go across to my other two guests who've been waiting patiently while we spoke to Edward Price, and my sincere apologies to them. Let me introduce those guests now. We have Ambassador Shashank with us, former Foreign Secretary of India. Sir, as always, great to have you on the show with us. And also joining me at this point is Harold Buchman. He's the founder of Low Altitude Economy News, joining us live from Shanghai. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Ambassador Shashank, let me ask you this question. Just yesterday, Donald Trump, when asked why no further action was being taken by the United States against Putin and Russia, actually said, what makes you think I've not taken any new action? Look at the tariffs I've imposed on India, and I've not even started phase 2 and phase 3 yet. That does look like a threat that he could actually go ahead and make things even worse for India and the India-US relationship. What did you make of that statement?
You know, it's a way of looking at what is happening between India and USA and what is happening to India's own objectives to become a Vikasit Bharat by 2047. I think we should actually congratulate and thank President Trump that we wanted to become a junior partner with the United States, and we had almost moved away from our partnership with the Asian countries and in East Asia Summit. You know, you remember that RCEP, where we wanted to set up economic and commercial partnerships with the East Asian countries, and then we moved out of it because we felt that we were much better off with the United States, UK, and the other developed countries because we were going to become a Viksit Bharat with their help. That would have been a junior partnership with them. President Trump has now moved us into a different position where we cannot afford to be a junior partner with China because we would very much like to continue our long-term trusted relationship with the Russians and make sure that Russians do not become a junior partner and we do not become a junior partner. So therefore, I think this is an opportunity once again given to India, and I hope that this time, knowing and seeing the chemistry among these three leaders in Tianjin, I think we are really perhaps moving towards our goals. So we should be grateful to President Trump for what he has done. And as regards his ambition to get Nobel Peace Prize, that is really between the Nobel Committee and the President of the United States. How do they work on it? India really is nowhere in that area. If he goes to second and third stage of his actions against India, that would only show that he's so afraid of Russia and China that he cannot deal with them. He is thinking in terms of somehow coming down harshly on the global south, whether it's Brazil, whether it is India, whether it's Venezuela, African countries. So therefore, it is really, in a way, I would say that you're lucky that we had the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit at this level. Prime Minister Modi did not attend the last summit, but he decided to go to this summit, which is really was not for a bilateral visit, but became a bilateral visit also of great importance. So I think I would say that, well, we are moving in a correct direction. We should further strengthen our relations and supply chain partnerships with the other Asian countries, also with Africa, particularly with Japan. And I think we should be able to move ahead in a focused manner, which we should have done all along.
Okay, you're obviously somebody who believes in looking at the brighter side of life. That makes you an optimist. We will come back to you, sir, and discuss the SEO summit in Tianjin in greater detail in just a moment. But let me bring in Harold at this point. Harold, firstly, your thoughts of what Trump said yesterday. It almost sounded like he was threatening India with further sanctions to squeeze Putin, hoping that Putin will put an end to the Ukraine war. Frankly, it doesn't make sense to anyone here in India. And secondly, I want your response to what the chief economist at Moody's, the credit rating agency, has said. He says the United States is on the brink of recession. A vast majority of states are either already in a state of recession or at the high risk of entering one. Do you agree?
These are all huge topics. I hope you can hear me because we didn't get to the sound check. Is it okay? Okay.
We can hear you, Harold. Please go ahead.
I'm honored to be here the first time with these very great guests as well. As to your questions, these are obviously very, very big questions. Let me start with the recession maybe first. In terms of US economy, this is a very complicated topic because it is not just a question, are the numbers above or below zero growth? I think what's really important is to question the number of GDP as a whole, especially if we compare it to countries like China. If we look at things like the production of electricity, the production of steel, the real economy, China is so far ahead of the US that it's not a question of when will China catch up or take over the US economy. It's completely on different levels. So what the US economy is really, and what's in these GDP numbers, that's hugely inflated prices, for example, for medical services. It's hugely inflated prices in the stock market, bubbles in AI, in all kinds of sectors that make the GDP look big. But in fact, what's there for the people, for the working class, so to speak, the common people in the US, I think there's been a recession for a long time, especially if we combine it with the inflation that's going on. So the prices go up, the salaries don't go up. That means life gets harder for the common people. And I think that is the situation that Trump is in. And if I may slightly disagree with the other guests that you've had on, I think it's maybe not correct to only push this on Trump. Yes, Trump is the bully in the room. He's like the elephant in the porcelain shop, but it's not a fundamental change in foreign policy. The US has always had this policy of do as I tell you, not as I do. And if you don't do what I tell you, then I'm going to see to color revolution you or to just, give you a negative impact on the international stage. And Trump has just accelerated it. But if we look back at 2017, when Trump started with the economic war against China, he said trade wars are easy to win, and let me show you how it's done. 3 years later, obviously, it wasn't successful. But has Biden rolled back any of the aggressive economic measures against China? I don't think he has. The tariffs stayed in place, everything stayed in place. And I'm obviously an outside observer in China. I don't speak for the Chinese people, but I can tell you that in China, there was a huge disappointment when Biden came and did not roll back these measures because it just told the Chinese people, look, this is not a question of Republicans versus Democrats or Trump versus the political class. It's an ongoing, continuous, bullying, let's not call it aggression, or maybe we should call it aggression as well, of the US against other countries. And I'm super excited to see these, not just handshakes, but smiling handshakes between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping, because if we look at the greater Asia, these are the biggest economic and most populous countries in Asia and in the world. And if they get along positively, I think that's just a great thing for humanity. And I wish Europeans most of all would see it more positively.
Let's certainly hope that it goes beyond the optics of handshakes and hugs. And you know what's significant about what Moody's is saying is that while we know that the cost of living crisis was already a huge issue for the average American, it is Trump's tariffs that seem to be pushing the United States of America towards a recession. That's what makes this particular report or statement so significant. Ambassador Shashank, let me come back to you. This really has been the biggest story of the week. Both of you have referred to it, the SEO summit in Tianjin. Like I said, we saw great camaraderie among Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping and Putin, smiles, handshakes, hugs all around. What do you think was the signaling by these leaders from Tianjin, especially to the Trump administration? Do you believe that they have tried to send out a message that, you know, it's a multipolar world, we are going to assert our strategic autonomy, you're not going to dictate to us, and yes, there is a shifting balance of power whether you like it or not? Is that something you would agree with, or are we reading too much into it?
Well, ever since the Kazan summit, India and China have been trying to improve their bilateral relations, and as you have seen that there have been visits to China by various leaders, also to Russia by various Indian leaders, and they have talked about, let's say, the increasing the number of pilgrims for Mansarovar. They have been talked about the civil aviation links, about easier visa facilities, and also allowing once again the export of rare earth minerals and magnets to India, and also the APCs for the pharmaceuticals. So I think there are these various things which have been going on all this time, but I think what has happened and what you are referring to is this optics of the three leaders meeting, and especially President Putin and Prime Minister Modi spending about 50 minutes together in President Putin's car. I think that gives a very good feeling that, yes, I think that things are going to improve. There would be, on defense side, India would be getting the better technologies from Russia. Also from the Chinese side, perhaps there would be promises that terrorism would not be accepted by them. They would move against that. And if there are any red lines of India with regard to Pakistan or other countries which are trying to hurt India's interests, then they would go by India's views in this matter. May not be completely. It's going to be a very complex kind of a situation in future, but at least we are moving in the right direction. And I hope that we will be able to increase the manufacturing capacities in India. And as my friend has been saying that, you know, the Democrats and Republicans have both been working against the Chinese interests, and Chinese have learned that. They have already analyzed long time ago that there is a consensus among the Democrats and Republicans in the United States that China has to be treated as an adversary. And they are going all out to ensure that by 2049, if they have to become the number one power in the world, then they must build up ties with other countries on that basis and not be diverted by the wishes of few of their junior partners to drag them into various conflicts. And therefore, this was an extremely important decision between China and India when Prime Minister Modi said that no third country will be allowed to have any impact on our relations between India and China. So I think that is also an important thing. But one thing between Democrats and Republicans I keep in mind is that the Democrats encouraged India to go in for oil purchases and oil refining for the Europeans and others in order to have a stable oil market in the world. Secondly, the Democrats wanted the Indians to be positively influenced by the friend-shoring policies by friends of the United States. They were not really expecting that all the industry should come back to USA, because that would have meant already a contradiction in terms that they want to push out all the foreign workers and technical people, and then at the same time they want to bring in all the industries. Do they want to all go bankrupt? The same way as they have made the agricultural people in the Midwest, in the Rust Belt, more or less bankrupt by their policies with regard to China, markets for them. I think therefore there are contradictions in the President Trump's policies, and it's not President Trump. I think he's the leader, but he has found bad advisors, and I think those advisors need to be changed. And I hope that he does that sooner than later.
Okay. Harold, let me ask you this question. While the thaw in India-China ties has been welcomed by most here, and it also seems to have rattled many in Washington, but there are many who continue to be wary of China. And there is a trust deficit that still remains. Many ask, how can we trust China? Because it's not just that we have a long-standing border dispute. Memories of Galwan are still fresh in many people's minds. And very recently, during Operation Sindoor, there's clear evidence that China provided military assistance, including intelligence sharing, with Pakistan. Now, that, of course, is a very big matter of concern for India. So the question is, for the Russia-India-China axis to work, the trust deficit has to be bridged. How optimistic are you that these countries will be able to work out their differences and work together?
Yes, I feel you're throwing me right into the lion's den with this question. I mean, this is obviously a very, very tense relationship. The triangle Pakistan, China, India, obviously around the area of Kashmir, that's a very tense area. And the Chinese-Indian tension have gone on for a long time. I can obviously not speak to Indian viewpoints because I'm not that well informed of the Indian mood, but from sitting in China and speaking to a lot of Chinese, I know that the sentiment is similar, where people say, like, now Mr. Modi comes here, shakes hands, but maybe he's just doing that to threaten Trump, and inside secretly he's wishing that Trump gets upset and comes back to India and says, okay, I was wrong, and I work with India more positively. So basically he's just using China as a leverage against the US to change the US policies. That question mark is also in Chinese hands. As for the incidents at the Indian-Chinese border, I mean, I'm the neutral Swiss. I don't want to take positions. I don't know what happened. I just know that Indians are absolutely sure the Chinese attacked illegally, and Chinese are absolutely convinced that Indians made an incursion into China. And as you said, this needs to be resolved in a very deep level, trust building. This cannot be just resolved. But I want to say one thing, and I think that's really a precedent for humanity that goes beyond just this region. The fact that India and China could agree at such a tense border to not use firearms, and then both sides actually adhering to this agreement and really following through, even in a situation that was violent, that led to deaths even, that both sides did not choose to escalate and go back to armed conflict. I think that's really a big hope for humanity, to show the world that conflicts can be managed. They cannot be avoided, but they can be managed. And if China and India continue to move from managing the conflict to increasing trust and cooperation in other parts, then I'm actually optimistic that Asia can show the world a new model of conflict resolution.
Well, let's certainly hope that the two countries can do that. We, of course, have a very fraught past. Ambassador Shashank, I will give you the last word. Many analysts on my show, especially those from the US, including Edward Price, who we had on the show earlier, have said, the Russia-India-China or RIC axis cannot replace the India-US relationship. In terms of democratic values, for instance, India's much more aligned with the US than it can ever be with a country like China. Plus, they argue that the trust deficit and the border dispute between the two countries is not going to go away, while Trump is not going to stay in power forever. What's your take on that, sir?
Well, I would say that USA, right from India's independence time, has always believed in this idea of alignment, and that those who are not aligned with USA or listening to USA's diktats are against it. And they have continued to do that all along. I think what they have to continue to understand that India is not replacing Pakistan in their affection. So they are trying to constantly put India and Pakistan in the same basket and give them dictations. But what they have to regard that India has a view of Asia, of the world, of its own. And many Indians have made their homes in the United States and many other countries, and they are doing extremely well. So therefore, for them to feel that Indians don't have a mind of their own and they have to be dictated to by the American brilliant people, I think that's perhaps not correct. India would like America and Russia and China, all of them, to take India's viewpoint in their stride to try to improve relations. And that is when India can help in bringing about an end to the war in Europe. Also, better relations among the Asian countries who are really not very happy with the muscle flexing by the Chinese. So I think there could be a future where India can convey its views to the other powers. And we are more hopeful right now with Russia and China in the RIC. But we hope that the American system also, over a period of time, they will think that really by putting pressure on their allies, on their friends, and on their adversaries, they are really not going the right way. So I think, therefore, they need to really rethink their traditional policies of destabilizing other countries, of changing governments, of killing leaders of other countries. No, I think they should really go in a different way. And there are many Indians living in the United States. They can talk to them and they can find that they are not really their enemy. They are their friends. So I think this is what I think Europeans have been trying to convey to the Americans, that they are their friends. And at the same time, they are also trying to build good relations with the other countries in the South, in the global South. So I think this is the final word which I would like to say, that there is a new world which is possible. India is working in that direction, and we will continue to work in that way.
So, final question before I let you go. I mean, we have the former Foreign Secretary of India on the show, so I'm tempted to ask you this question. Do you agree with the recent New York Times report, which in a sense confirmed what a lot of us have believed all along, that Donald Trump has acted against India out of personal pique and vendetta because India refused to give him credit for the ceasefire with Pakistan and is reluctant to nominate him for a Nobel Peace Prize? The report refers to a conversation between Donald Trump and Prime Minister Modi that apparently took place on the 17th of June, and it says that's where relations between the two leaders broke down.
Well, I would say New York Times, Washington Post have never been the best friends of India in the past also. And there are many people in America who would like to pass on all the blame of their lack of vision to India. I think they should become better advisors, or President Trump should find better advisors. And I think all these advisors and media people, they are trying to convey to President Trump that he's all right. And he and his colleagues are making huge amount of money. Even many people from the Democratic Party are making huge amount of money. So therefore, there is a disconnect between the people of America and the leadership in the United States and the two political parties. They really have to think about their own people. And as people have been saying, Edward Price said and others said that maybe next year when there are elections, then there will be a reality check as to how the American people feel about it. That is only, I would say, but that is really for the American people to decide. I don't have any say in that.
All right. Always a pleasure talking to you, sir. Ambassador Shashank and Harold Buchman, thank you so much for joining me on Global Pulse tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that's all the time we have on this edition of Global Pulse. If you have been, thanks so much for watching. Do join us again.